Good to have all of you here this morning for class. And if you will turn your Bibles to Matthew chapter 12. Matthew chapter 12. And we're going to try to cover this section 1 through 14. And depending on what your heading is in your study Bible, at the top of that, it may be something like Jesus is Lord of the Sabbath. So if you have your Bibles, follow along, and I want to start by reading that paragraph. Matthew chapter 12, 1 through 14. At that time, Jesus went through the grain fields on the Sabbath. His disciples were hungry and began to pick some heads of grain and eat them. And when the Pharisees saw this, they said to him, "Look, your disciples are doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath." And he answered, "Haven't you read what David did when he and his companions were hungry? He entered the house of God, and he and his companions ate the consecrated bread, which was not lawful for them to do, but only for the priest. Or haven't you read in the law that the priests on the Sabbath day in the temple desecrate the Sabbath and yet are innocent? I tell you that something greater than the temple is here. If you had known what these words mean, I desire sacrifice, or I desire mercy, not sacrifice, you would not have condemned the innocent, for the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath." Going on from that place, he went into their synagogue, and a man with a shriveled hand was there. Looking for a reason to bring charges against Jesus, they asked him, "Is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath?" And he said to them, "If any of you has a sheep and it falls into a pit on the Sabbath, will you not take hold of it and lift it out? How much more valuable is a person than a sheep? Therefore it is lawful to do good on the Sabbath." Then he said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." So he stretched it out. It was completely restored, just as sound and healthy as the other one. But the Pharisees went out and plotted how they might kill Jesus. This is quite an extraordinary episode, isn't it? I think one thing that it challenges is the basic notion, what is God really looking for? And is it ever okay to do something good, even if it sets aside what we might think is a very important religious obligation? Probably the best way to say that. This hit at the core of something for the Pharisees, because when Jesus heals the man and his hand as good as the other one, they know what's going on. They see it. But they are so intent on trapping Jesus. They're so intent in negating the effect of his ministry that after Jesus goes out and we'll see this, he actually puts into practice the question they brought up. But they're so dead set against him that after he does something good, they go out and they plot to kill him. Now, I want you to let that sink in for a moment. That is how strongly they were against Jesus and his ministry. That right before them was something that was done good. Here is a man's life that was, and think about this, radically changed. Now he's got two good hands. About 8 or 10 weeks ago, I cracked my elbow. Some of you may know about that. And I kept trying to pretend it wasn't an issue. It just kept getting worse and worse. I went to the doctor, and probably one of the most painful things was he had me put it up like this, and they had to take 3 different angles of x-ray, on it. Oh, that really killed me. Well, over the next 8 weeks, he said, "Now, I don't want you to use it." He said, "Now, we're not going to put it in a sling because we want you to keep the range of motion." So I've been able to do that. Do you know how many things you do using your elbow? Have you ever considered, just not using a hand for a while? wow. And so it gave me an insight into this guy who has this hand that needs to be healed. He probably hadn't been able to use it. And think about how radically now his life has changed. Jesus has healed this man. He now has the use of two hands. Wow. So not only is his day-to-day life going to be radically changed, but it's the power of Jesus being used for good. And the Pharisees can't see that. They want to negate all of that, and because they're so intent on getting rid of Jesus because they feel so threatened by him, they go out and they plot to kill him. It's amazing to me how destructive through the years, it's not just Christianity, other world religions, it's amazing to me how destructive religious causes have been through human history. That if somebody doesn't agree with you, you go out and try to destroy them in the name of religion. Unbelievable. Well, it's not unique to our day and time. Okay. So as we look at Matthew 12, Jesus is Lord of the Sabbath. Now, it says at that time, this is after this period of teaching, it's interesting. We have chapter 10 in through 11. There's some lengthy sections of teaching by Jesus. 12 and 13 is going to have some lengthy sections of teaching. So Jesus kind of pauses after some teaching. After that time, he went through the grain fields on the Sabbath, and his disciples were hungry and began to pick some heads of the grain and eat them. And of course, not only was this permissible practice back then, but the problem was they were doing it on the Sabbath. If you ever have an opportunity to read some in the Talmud and the Mishnah and all of the known restrictions that are written down for Jewish practice of what you could not do on the Sabbath, it's amazing. Now, and I thought about saying this for a moment, and it's kind of like a bar of soap. I want to lather on this for a moment. It is so fascinating to me how good intentions, when you start here, there's good intentions, good motives, end up way over here, totally destructive and abusive and everything else you can think of. Think about this for a moment. All of the restrictions that the Jews came up with, we have to assume there was a good motive behind a lot of this. They wanted to be sure that they honored God and didn't violate the Sabbath. I mean, that sounds good, doesn't it? Okay. Well, as they began doing that, they began to get into uncharted territory. Okay? So guidelines and suggestions, after a while, became sacred non-negotiables. And it's fascinating how things travel that distance. So by the time Jesus comes on the scene, there were a lot of things that they had come to the point where these were sacred issues. You don't question them, you don't violate them, and certainly if you want to be seen as a religious leader, you have to practice them. And Jesus comes along and kind of sweeps away all of those. No wonder he gets into trouble. And so you're going to see, I love the way this narrative is set up. Notice at that time Jesus went through the grain fields of the Sabbath and his disciples were hungry. The reason that's so wonderfully set up for us is that sometimes we are in a situation and we have to make a decision. Human need trumps religious ritual. I don't know another way to say it. And we all know this. For example, I'm assuming that most of you sitting here this morning, it's your practice and your tradition to come and assemble so that you can worship with brothers and sisters in Christ. But I would be very disturbed if there was a human need that you had an opportunity to respond to, and on a particular Sunday morning you said, it's more important for me to go worship than it is to help that person. That means we've missed the point. Now, there are opportunities, and there will be occasions where we're faced with a tough dilemma. And you always know when that is, when you're like, oh, what do I do? You know? You're like, why didn't somebody tell me the answer here? So we're presented with a dilemma. And it's like two obligations are almost, like two rams butting their head together. It's like they're two immovable objects. And you're like, oh, this is right and this is right, but which one do I do? Because if I do this one, I won't be doing this one. If I do this one, I'm not going to do this one. And you're like, so we're faced with those. Here, I have a theory about this, and you might want to word it differently. Those are occasions, wonderful occasions for us to think through our priorities of faith and action. Why am I doing what I'm doing? If I decided that I didn't want to participate in helping someone and miss a Sunday morning assembly, what would be my justification for that? And could I sleep with a clear conscience when I did that? See, it seems to me it's almost as if it's a question eventually sleeping with a clear conscience. So I made that decision. Did it honor God? Sure did. Did it respond to a genuine need? It sure did. Well, guess what? That trumps something else I think I would want to do and have been in the habit of doing. So, and I think we sort of know that. I remember years ago, because remember, this story as Jesus tells it, it's not only the sheep that falls in the pit. We've heard it expressed as, traditionally the ox that falls in the ditch. And I remember, and I wish I could remember who it was. So, well, if that happens on Sunday morning, the response was, you either need to get rid of the ox or fill up the ditch, so that won't happen. Well, here's my response to that. We often don't, and think about this. How many of us have control over the situations around us? We don't. And think about it, if as Christians we had the power to eliminate all the dilemmas we'd ever have to face, we might think, wow, that would be smooth Christian living without those difficult choices. But instead, I think we have them fairly often, and in the world in which we live, they are wonderful opportunities for us to grow from them, to be stretched a little bit. I've come to a clear notion about spiritual growth. And Bill, you can add to this if you feel like it in terms of what you've noticed through the years. Spiritual growth occurs, and I think it has to occur with two things at once. Number one, you have to know yourself so well that you know what kind of fills up your well. What do you need to do to nourish yourself spiritually? But there's also another one. And if we ignore it, we're not going to grow very much. Where do I need to be stretched so I can grow? You have to have both dynamics going on at the same time. Filling your well up and being nourished, but also stretched and challenged. Now, that aspect, and this is what gets Jesus into trouble, because he's going to stretch and challenge his audience constantly, and they don't like it, okay? The stretching can occur in one of two ways. This is fascinating. You can identify maybe where you feel like you need to grow and go ahead and intentionally do things to stretch yourself. You also can be put in a situation where you stretch and you can grow, but you weren't asked to be put there. That life itself will present those opportunities that will challenge you, and you have to grow or else you're really in trouble. So it can be either by choice or not by choice that you can stretch and grow. Yeah, Bill?
You walk around it there. I think the point that I've seen with most people is when they have come to a large struggle in their life and they succeed getting through it is where they have that spiritual growth at the end of it.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
It's like the results of exercise.
Exactly. You remember years ago people would say, trying to get others to exercise, no pain, no gain now. No pain, no gain. It's the same way spiritually, isn't it? That when God and His Spirit and the power of the risen Lord enables us to go through something that's very, very challenging, I think two things has to happen. Number one, you need to thank God that you got through it. God, without you, I would never have made it, okay? And number two is to sit down and say, okay, God, What lesson did I learn from this experience that helped me to grow? And specifically, how did I grow? And what do I need to give you honor and praise for? Because see, if we don't take that route, there's another route that we can take, and it's more of a humanistic approach, and that is we gripe and complain because things were tough. And it's so easy to slip into that griping mold. I didn't want to go through that. I didn't learn much from it. Why did I have to go through it? I didn't deserve it. All that kind of stuff. And that really isn't at the heart of spiritual growth, is it? And it's so easy to slip into that griping mode when really as Christians, and I think this is the different thing we bring to the table. Christians bring to the table of life experiences that constant desire to be more and more like Christ and asking God, what did you teach me through this? What did I learn? How did I grow? How did it make me a better person? See, all of those things. And it is a real challenge. And as you see, Jesus gets into trouble because he challenges people with this. Okay.
I can understand when you start looking back at the scripture and what they were taught, you can understand to a certain degree why they were so confused about the Sabbath. I mean, all through the Old Testament they were taught you don't do anything on the Sabbath, even up to the point of being killed.
Yeah.
But it was the content of their heart is what Christ was trying to teach them. And we talked about that last week.
Yeah.
How they were so they held the law, the physical law above mankind.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what Christ was trying to tell them. You're talking about following the law, yet the love of God exceeds everything. Why would you not do good to you?
And David, and Jesus does something else with this. This is really interesting. In his response, he's going to choose two things in the Old Testament that were practiced even when the law was in force. And the reason he does this is he's forcing his listeners to deal with the issue that even existed back then, and people sort of broke the law, and they weren't punished for it. And he gives two examples. Okay, the first, haven't you read what David did when he and his companions were hungry? He entered the house of God, and he and his companions ate the consecrated bread, which was not lawful for them to do, but only for the priest. Oh, okay. And you can imagine they're sitting there listening to Jesus, and they know the story. Or, haven't you read the law that the priests on the Sabbath day in the temple desecrate the Sabbath and yet are not innocent? And what they mean by that, if you take time and look at some of the things that priests would do, think about the sacrificing of animals. Other actions that if you actually thought about it, the actions in and of themselves would be unlawful and desecrate the Sabbath. But Jesus says, everybody knows that, yeah, theoretically, it would desecrate the Sabbath, but because it is done within the context of honoring God and the greater issues, nobody thinks about that. That's what the priests are supposed to be doing. But Jesus uses that for this principle, and it's quite ingenious because I am sure they're okay. It's making them rub their foreheads and think about this. So, the reason I said all that was it's this human need that they were hungry that brings it to the forefront. And the Pharisees saw this. There are some commentators, when they look at verse 2, when the Pharisees saw this, they believe it's kind of the idea the Pharisees were always on his tail wherever he went, looking for things.
We want to justify ourselves, but we want to look at other people and condemn them. And that's what they were doing.
Oh, and they were good at it, weren't they? They were good at it. Yeah, Bill?
Within this, there was nothing wrong with them getting the grain to eat. This was in the law.
Right.
You could not put it in a basket, you couldn't put it in a pocket or take it with you, you could get a handful
Yeah.
and eat it. The problem was this was considered reaping, which was work, and work was a no-no on the Sabbath.
Exactly. And so because they think they've got, see, here's the interesting, they think they've got Jesus now. Because when the Pharisees saw this, see, they're looking to trap him. They're looking to catch him with something that they think he has really violated the law.
I mean, it's amazing to me. They ask him, is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath?
Oh, yeah.
I mean, they're not even thinking in terms of a miracle that he's fixing to perform or that he can do. All they want to know is it lawful for him to do it?
Just the question in and of itself makes you realize they have misplaced their priorities. Yeah.
We've done the same thing in modern times. In some churches, there has been great controversy over whether having the Lord's Supper before the sermon or after the sermon.
Oh, yeah.
And it has become a law in some places that's when you have it.
Yeah.
Either before or after, one of the two.
Well, and think about that. That's a neat observation in that Christian practice methods can be viewed as sacred law and are by some people. And if you dare have a different view,
Eyebrow raising, if when we first came in, we had the Lord's Supper first before anything else. No singing, no announcements, no nothing.
yeah. It's human nature. See, think about this too. I mean, there's so many good things we could talk about with this. Part of it also is related to human psychology. And we don't like to talk about that much, but part of our human nature seeks order. It's just kind of the way we're made. Although today it looks like we're living in a culture of disorder. Because we seek order, if you're not careful, your security ends up being in what you have found to be that order. And what that threatens then is the idea and the reality that our security is not in anything with its order. Our security is in our relationship with Jesus Christ. And Jesus is getting at the heart of some of this long-held practice and psychological lawful stuff that the Pharisees for years and generations have taken as normal. And here comes this guy named Jesus, and he's challenging everything. And I've often said, especially remember when we started this whole study of the book of Matthew, it just intrigues me how that Jesus, it seems like every day, he enjoys stepping on these sacred eggs that the Pharisees have laid out. He squishes every one of them. And it's no wonder that he ends up on the cross. They can't stand him. And here are some of the passages in the Old Testament. We don't have time to cover all of those, but they have to do with some of the laws and the practices of the Old Testament with those things. One person said this: the necessity of the case here, in this instance, allowed to override the ceremonial ordinance, and our Lord teaches men through that single instance to see the general principle that when positive commands and necessities involving the good of man come into collision, the latter and not the former must prevail. So these are, when you see that collision, responding to human needs is what takes precedent. And we know that. I mean, that's what it's all about. Remember I mentioned this. He says that the priests in the temple profane the temple by their very act. Something greater than the temple is here. This is interesting. Jesus doesn't literally say someone, he says something. And nobody knows why. Why did he say something? It may be that he wants to include both the someone, who is he, but also the principle he's talking about. And it may be that because he uses this word something, he's trying to say something like, everything I've been teaching you in response to your question and the illustrations I brought up are really embodied in me. And this, of course, is a very common practice of Jesus. He'll say, if you want to know what I'm talking about, look at what I'm doing. Look at who I am. Something greater than the temple is here. Well, what is that something greater? It's Jesus, who embodies the priority of human needs. Think about his very ministry. Jesus came to this world because of the greatest human need of salvation and dealing with sin that nobody else could. That was his number one reason. Number two, something is greater than the temple is here because he was willing to sacrifice himself for that need, and that took priority in all the reasons why he did ministry the way he did. Bill?
I see it as treating the temple and the Jewish worship as a system versus the system of Christianity. The temple system was centrally located. There was a point, there was a place. The Christian system is worldwide. There is no place that is that sacred place as it was under the system of Judaism.
Yeah. Or you could also append that by saying that for Jesus, the place becomes the human heart. See, and how we see this is in how Matthew reconfigures what kingdom's all about. Is kingdom about place and a king in rule? A king has power over a certain place? Is it the high priest with rule over temple area and activities in the temple? Well, for Jesus, the rule of God replaces that kind of power and place, and it is God reigning in the human heart. And this is why when Jesus starts conceiving of his kingdom, it's all over the world. There are no boundaries. You're exactly right. There are no boundaries. And think about, this, wow. It's hard to get our heads around this. For the Jewish Christian, I wonder how hard it was for them to make this shift. That the temple in Jerusalem is not the central place anymore. It's in here. I just can't imagine.
If you destroy this temple,
Yeah.
in 3 days I'll raise it up again. And
Yeah.
they just went into a rage because they destroyed the temple. That was just unthinkable.
And they were thinking he was talking about the real one.
Right.
Yeah.
And then Paul also said, do you not know that your body is the temple of God?
Mm-hmm. So we do have very specific references in the New Testament that the physical temple of Jerusalem is no longer. It is interesting. Let me think. Once in Corinthians, Christians are viewed as collectively making up the temple of God. But it's a metaphorical use by Paul. And again, it was so hard for Jewish Christians, I think, to make that shift in their thinking. No longer about place. It's about heart and relationships in Jesus.
Paul would often use the temple as a place of conversion
he did.
or teaching in order to gain more converts to Christ.
Well, and wow, this is a whole fascinating topic. In Acts and in Paul's letters, we find that for Paul's conception of mission, he loved to go to the synagogues, didn't he? And he would go there because think of how the background of the audiences, they knew the Old Testament scriptures. They knew the Hebrew scriptures. And so what Paul and the other apostles would attempt to do is build off of the Old Testament framework to present who Jesus is. Sometimes they had individuals who got it and responded well. Many times they didn't want to hear it and they didn't respond very well. And that's a whole different story, but it's just amazing. Okay, now we talked about that something. Jesus says, for if you had known what these words mean, I desire mercy and not sacrifice. These are very important words to define Jesus' entire ministry. It was used earlier in Matthew 9:13. And I would say that this is an Old Testament text from Hosea. It's interesting that it comes from Hosea. That defined, it's one of the defining biblical principles of Jesus' entire ministry, is that he demonstrated God's desire for mercy and not sacrifice. And I am assuming that when he quotes that, the idea of sacrifice stands for not just the sacrifice, but also all of the ritual and all the traditions that had arisen around sacrifice. So that much of the method, much of the tradition, everything that sort of grew up around sacrifice became more important than this priority of mercy. And this is one of those verses that I think clearly defines Jesus' entire ministry. It's like the foundation of everything he does. If you had known what it meant that I desire mercy and not sacrifice, you wouldn't be pressing this issue. And the reason that that's important for us to know is because just here in a second, he heals this man's hand, his arm, and the audience still doesn't get it. He's demonstrating mercy over sacrifice. And instead of saying, see, think of how this could have ended. One of the Pharisees could have said, wow, Jesus quoted from Hosea 6 and verse 6, and now he's healed this gentleman over here. Maybe we need to put those things together and think about this. Because not only has he quoted a text, but he's provided us a living example of that. What a great learning opportunity. Well, that's not what the Pharisees did. Instead, they went out and they plotted how they might kill Jesus. That was not a very receptive audience, was it? But
in my youth, in churches of Christ who were dogmatic in the ways that they did things. And I can understand exactly what took place here. And it took me a long time to understand that love was at the core of everything that we do.
wow.
So imagine what these men, and again it was the intent of their heart,
Yeah.
is what Christ was teaching against, to make that change, to understand what it was Christ was telling them.
Well, I'll ask the question, and you don't have to raise your hand if you don't want to, because I'm not asking you to vote or raise your hand on this. How many of us, looking back on our spiritual journey, had to make that journey from dogmatism to mercy? Do any of you know what David's talking about? I don't want you to raise your hand. I'm not asking for confession here. But I think what you just said, David, has hit a lot of people. That for some of us, we've had to make that journey from dogmatism to mercy. And it's a hard journey. One of the first, and that's an entire lesson that's amazing. One of the first things you have to deal with is the realization, and it's almost a slap in the face. When you come to the realization you've had your heart in the wrong place, it's an earth-shattering thing. You're like, wow, I have been emphasizing the wrong thing. Whoa. If that's true, is there something else in my life I've been emphasizing wrong? So it opens up the floodgate of serious introspection on things that have not been right. Johnny?
Yeah, it goes like that. Why should I destroy my brother or sister just to get my way?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, Romans 14 comes up, doesn't it? Sure does. Makes you think through these things, okay? Oh, well, yeah.
Legalism versus relationship.
Yeah.
When you're legalistic, like the Pharisees, you're not thinking about relationship with other people.
No, and you're not thinking about human needs being met either, are you? Human needs being met in relationships, no, they're not that important. It's all about performing the ritual so that you feel secure and safe. Yeah, Bill? Yeah.
One of those modern illustrations is how hard has it been for many people to adjust to the fact that the men waiting on the table no longer wearing ties and coats.
Ooh. And that's a perfect example, isn't it? Yeah, it sure is. Oh, let's pick up there next week. Thank you all for your interaction this morning.